Certainly when I look at the area of policy with which I'm most concerned, in other words, the natural world and the climate crisis, then the only way I can possibly make sense of why it is that politicians know what they know and yet still don't act is that they have had a massive, tragic, existential lack of imagination to think about what is this future that we are deliberately constructing.
Hello and welcome to The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and this is a podcast about the deep values of the people shaping our common life. Every episode, you'll hear an interview with someone who has a public voice or platform and hopefully get beyond their public persona to get a sense of the deep principles they are trying to live by. Guests come from all different political, religious, and non-religious and professional perspectives. And part of the point is to help us grow in understanding, maybe even empathy, with people who might be very different from ourselves. You have joined us in a special season connected to the book I've just published, Fully Alive, Tending to the Soul in Turbulent Times. And the book is a series of personal essays, loosely and, I hope, playfully structured around the 7 deadly sins. And so part of what I'm wanting to chew over with guests this season is one of those themes, one of those sins. In my chapter on avarice, greed, if you will, I'm really reflecting a lot on consumerism and the climate crisis and my own complicity in all of those things. And so a really good person to talk to seemed to be Caroline Lucas. She has been and still is the UK's only Green Party MP. She's standing down at this election. As well as being an MEP formerly and the leader of her party, she's published various books. And the most recent one is called Another England. We spoke about her career, her values, what she's going to do next. We had a really fascinating conversation. I hope you enjoy listening, and there are some reflections, as usual, from me at the end. Caroline, we're going to dive straight in with something that hopefully will get us all thinking, although I'm not sure any of us know the definitive answer to it, which is, what does fully aliveness mean to you?
I think fully aliveness means being in the moment, paying attention, mindfulness, for the want of a better word. I think it's so easy, speaking for myself, to go through whole days at a time without actually remembering that you're alive, which sounds a very odd thing to say because obviously we know we're alive. But that sense of self-consciousness and awareness and that mindfulness for me is a key part of it. I think being fully alive also means about being who you have the potential to be and exploring that in every avenue of your life that you are able to do. Finding your passion, finding your purpose, to me feels about, that's what being fully alive means. And finally, maybe something about taking risks and finding joy where you can, whether that's in a flower coming up between the paving stones of a pavement, or whether it's in a relationship, or if it's in, wherever it is, just remembering that we are alive for a very short time. And I know, speaking for myself, my greatest regret is being on my deathbed and feeling, oh my God, that was not a dress rehearsal, that was it. And there are things that I wish I had done that I have not done.
Yes. Thank you. It's funny, even as you're talking, I can feel myself settling down, being like, okay, be present to your body, notice, the leaves that I can see outside the window. We just need so many of these little reminders, don't we?
We do.
Here now.
My great guide on that is the poet Mary Oliver. I just love the way that she makes paying attention into something that is, some kind of, it's a duty, it's a responsibility, as well as a pleasure. And I think she expresses it so beautifully in her poetry.
Yes, she does. Attention as a moral act and defining of the good life. So I wonder, this may feel connected. It is for many people, but sometimes isn't. If you are happy to say something about your deep values, are there some principles that you have really tried to live by, even though obviously we all fail at times?
Yes. I mean, I'm thinking of my life as a green politician as well as an individual, and I suppose hopefully there's some alignment between the two. But when you first asked me that question, I think of the answer more, I suppose, actually in my political life, where it does feel as if the Green Party and as a green politician, then integrity and honesty seem to be so important that I think. Maybe one of the reasons that I was attracted to green politics in the first place was that sense of the importance of speaking truth to power, even if that's uncomfortable, both for the person speaking it and for the person hearing it. So there is something about that kind of radical honesty, if you like, that I find is something that I aspire to. I might not always achieve it, but it feels like it is so important, even more important today perhaps than ever before, at a time when there is so much misinformation out there and so much of a gap that I think people can see between what people say, what they do. There is just this massive disjunction. So something around honesty and integrity, being true to oneself, linked to that, I hope is an aspiration, at least around fearlessness. Risking being unpopular, even if that's if that's the price to pay for saying things or doing things that people might not necessarily approve. And then something about compassion. I'm not sure if I was trying to think, is compassion a value? I'm not sure if it is, but anyway, whatever it is, I think compassion and empathy and kindness are massively overlooked forces that we need more than ever.
Yes. And have you had times where those values seem to pull against each other? Because it feels like sometimes telling the truth and the fearlessness to be honest, whilst kind of the kindness and empathy thing, is it just me who can find there's a tension there? How has that shown up in your life?
No, I think that's an incredibly good question, because sometimes it can seem to be kind, can't it? Not to tell the truth, and I think it's about how you do it. And again, I'm sorry, I'm reaching for my political experience rather than my personal experience. But the most obvious way, I suppose.
No need to apologize. These things are intertwined.
They are so intertwined, and I think in my life, one of the moments that I experience that tension is when you're talking about the shift that we all need to make to a greener way of life, if you like, and doing that in a way that doesn't sound like you're criticizing individuals for the choices that they make. And I think there's a recognition sometimes that's necessary about the limited choices people have, in terms of being able to make a more environmentally sound choice. Maybe that's more expensive, maybe it's more difficult, maybe the option just isn't there for people. People are struggling just to put food on the table, and to start banging on to them about a climate crisis could seem the most irrelevant and frankly insulting thing to be doing when they're just worrying about can they get their child fed tomorrow. So I think a lot of it is about how you do it. And so I think, to try and answer your question, I think there are ways of reconciling the honesty and the compassion, but it needs attention, and it doesn't happen. The one doesn't follow the other automatically, and it is about how you do it.
Yeah. And if I see that in you, having been sort of deep in your work and your life, I can hear that tone and that posture of wanting to both be urgent, actually. And of all the sort of stalwart lifelong campaigners I have spent time in, the mind of, you seem the least... and maybe we'll come to this in terms of your formation, but I very rarely hear you sounding contemptuous and eye-rolling and despairing in a way that I imagine you've had to really concentrate on.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't like to promise that I've never eye-rolled when I sit on the green benches opposite the Prime Minister. I suspect I have, but overall, I think I do believe that our politics needs more compassion. Indeed, there's an organisation called Compassion in Politics with which I'm involved, and there is a distinction between having compassion for individuals and being fiercely opposed to some of the policies that their own logic leads them to espouse, I guess. And I think that compassion is important.
Great. Well, let's try and get a sense of how you became the kind of person with these values and this approach to fully aliveness. Could you tell me a bit about your childhood and particularly any big ideas that were in there, religious, political, or other?
Yeah, I saw on other podcasts you've done, this is a question that you ask, and I was suddenly struck with horror that I'm not sure if there were any big ideas in my childhood. I suppose it depends when childhood ends and adulthood takes over. But I mean, I grew up in a caring but for the want of a better word, I don't want to use the word normal. No family is ever normal, is it? It's probably very abnormal. But anyway, I had a very sort of conventional upbringing, perhaps that's what I would say, with parents who were conservative voters. But political issues were never discussed at home or around the table, and books didn't feature really very much in the house at all, apart from a few Reader's Digest books. And so, actually, if I think about what were the influences on me as a child growing up, it was actually a friendship in particular that really changed my life. So when I went to secondary school, I met a friend called Rachel. So I'm about 11 or 12 at this point. And my friendship with her did change my life, because she came from a family that was the diametric opposite of my own, in the sense that the house was not neat and tidy like my house. It was a total chaos, but it was wonderful because you couldn't move for tripping over piles of books. And it was with Rachel that, for example, my love of literature grew. So instead of doing our music practice at school, she would be smuggling in books by Emily Dickinson, and we would conspiratorially sit in the corner of the music practice room and read Emily Dickinson. Or we would be supposed to be at some kind of sports day, and again we would both kind of plead illness and then sneak off with with Thomas Hardy or something. So it was my friendship with her that was an eye-opening thing into literature and poetry in particular. Her mother was a wonderful character, and she decided that what I needed, aged 15, was to go to Paris, and I was certainly up for that. So we went to Paris, the two of us, Rachel and I, and her mum, and we were reading a book called Le Grand Monde by Alain Fournier, which is a beautiful romantic French novel in our French class. And it was about a magical lost domain. And she would know exactly the bridge that the author Alain Fournier was standing on when he saw the woman that became the muse for the novel. So we would go and relive that. And then we would go and visit the Rodin Museum. And then I remember... Sorry, this is a total distraction. It's just not really about big ideas.
I love it.
But it was about the exoticism of coming across vache qui rit cheese for the first time, those little dairy-lee triangles. And it was actually in France that we, it's not dairy-lee actually, is it? But anyway, vache qui rit, dairy-lee.
The laughing cow.
So it was just like I felt very much as if through that friendship, walls were being knocked down, curtains were being pulled from my eyes, and a whole different way of living in terms of culture and the arts became massively important to me. So I hope that counts as a big idea, but that was the big idea of my childhood, I think.
No, it does. And I love it. I feel like we don't pay attention to friendships and relationships enough, and as these deeply formative parts of our lives, that most of the big ideas that come to form us come through relationships, right? They come through someone we trust. They come from testimony. I've heard you speak about Rachel before, and I find it so beautiful. Are you still friends? Is she still around? What's going on with Rachel now?
She is still around, and I saw her a couple of weeks ago in Cambridge, where she lives. And she's a writer, and in the past, she's been a congregational minister, so she's had an extraordinary life, and she's still very, very important to me. Good. I was worried about asking that question in case it was pressing on a bruise, but
thank you. And you went to university, and were so immersed in literature. And tell me what, you went on to do a PhD in women's literature, and you've spoken about maybe wanting to be a writer. What is it that was drawing you? What is the thread that keeps pulling you back to the written word?
I think it's something about the importance of imagination. And I think perhaps that's what connects my political life to my sort of literary life, if you like. And certainly in the book that I've just written, the two come together, which was which felt a really lovely way of bringing together two parts of my life. So the reason I say imagination is so important is that I think that you could really make a very strong case to say that the failure of politics right now is a failure of imagination in the broadest and widest and deepest sense, by which I mean there is a stunning lack of empathy in politics right now. If I were to look at immigration policy just as one example, the way in which people seeking asylum, people who are trying to escape the most horrendous life experiences that they are facing, are somehow branded as hordes of immigrants who are threatening our shores. They are totally dehumanized. And I think that just shows a radical lack of imagination, putting yourself in the shoes of what it must be like to be that person. Or indeed the kind of demonization of people who are unable to work for whatever reason, quite often linked to mental health problems or physical health problems. So I think in one sense, when we look at social policy or even aspects of foreign policy, then a lack of imagination is there. And certainly when I look at the area of policy with which I'm most concerned, in other words, the natural world and the climate crisis, then the only way I can possibly make sense of why it is that politicians know what they know and yet still don't act is that they have had a massive, tragic, existential lack of imagination to think about what is this future that we are deliberately constructing and will be handing on to our kids and kids all around the world, that is going to make it increasingly impossible even to live on this precious planet. And that imagination to me feels like it's what's lacking in politics and what we find in literature. And if all politicians were forced to read a novel a week, then maybe politics would be in a better state.
That's really fascinating. And I want to come back to it because one of the key things I want to talk to you about is the kind of moral language / moral framing for this wicked problem of the world that we've built for ourselves. But I just want to stay a little bit on your political life. And there's lots we could say there, but there are, many good podcasts to I can point people to really walk through this extraordinary political career that you've had. I really want to ask you about formation of an MP. And formation is this word that is sort of sounds like a technical word. It's used a lot by the Jesuits, but it's basically who we are becoming. And Aristotle talked about the power of habit. And I've been writing and thinking a lot about formation as in the things we pay attention to regularly and repeatedly, and the relationships that we're in regularly and repeatedly change us, and they are who we become, and they shape our imagination, right? Reading novels is formation. It helps build our imagination and our empathy. And as those on the outside of Parliament look in, it's really quite a strange situation to be putting human beings in, isn't it, repeatedly? Could you say a little bit, because you've written about this, about the formation of being an MP and the way, if you're not careful, it will shape you, maybe for good, but I imagine also for ill.
Hi, I wondered if I could ask for your help. You may have noticed that we've been doing a lot of work behind the scenes to make this channel more beautiful, more enriching, more thought-provoking, and more life-giving. But 87% of you watching on this channel are not yet subscribed. So I wondered if you would just hit the little subscribe button. It means that you'll get these really thoughtful conversations in your feed, and it will also help other people find us. Thanks very much.
Yes, well, that's a very good question. And it reminds me of something that Margaret Beckett said to me. Margaret Beckett is a veteran Labour MP who's been in Parliament for many decades and been in Labour governments in the past. And I remember when I was first trying to get my head around the way that Parliament worked and just the many weirdnesses, which I'll come to in a second. But I do remember how she took me to one side and said, "Don't worry, you'll get used to it." And I thought, oh my God, that's the trouble. They've all got used to it. This is a very, very strange way of making decisions of any kind. And I suppose some of those eye-opening ways of making politics were to do with the fact that half the time people don't even know what they're voting on because basically the party whips have huge control over their party members, and so you get whipped if you're in one of the bigger parties to vote one way or another. And so when a bell goes for the vote, then you basically have 8 minutes to get from wherever you are on the parliamentary estate to the chamber. And believe me, sometimes that can mean running very fast to get from where my office is certainly to the chamber in 8 minutes. And the whole talk as you're running to the chamber is, what are we voting on? Who knows what we're voting on? Nobody knows. In fact, one of the few people that does know what we're voting on is me, because someone in my office, bless them, has had to spend ages trying to work out what the implications are of an amendment that says something like in paragraph 3, little 2, change and to or. And you need to do a bit of work to kind of work out what that actually really means. And so one of the changes that I tried to introduce very early on when I came to the Westminster Parliament was to request the requirement for anybody putting down an amendment to also include a short 50-word explanatory statement to explain what that purpose of that amendment is, so anybody looking at it can instantly see what that amendment does. And that was common practice in the European Parliament, where I had sat for 10 years before coming to Westminster. And the debate in Parliament about whether or not to include mandatory explanatory statements was so extraordinary, because you had MP after MP standing up to say, no, we don't need this, we don't want this. In other words, people arguing that they shouldn't be given the right to know what they're voting on. So that's just a tiny snapshot. But essentially, I think, stepping back and thinking about your question more broadly, there is a sense in which the political system is not set up to deliver the best results for ordinary people. It's set up to keep the dominant party of government in power. And another example of that would be when legislation goes through Parliament, a temporary committee is set up to look at it in depth, to scrutinise it. And you would have thought that you would want experts in the subject around that table inputting into the detail of the development of that policy. And there was a wonderful story that was told by Sarah Wollaston, who people might remember was a Tory MP from Totnes, and she was a doctor, a GP. And one of the reasons she was selected in Totnes by the residents of that town was because they really appreciated her as a local doctor with huge expertise in health. She tells a story about how she asked the Conservative Party whip if she could sit on the committee that had been set up to look at this issue of health and social care. And she was told no, that she had to go and sit on a committee instead that was going to look at something like double taxation in the Cayman Islands or something. And when she said, but I don't know anything about double taxation in the Cayman Islands, the whip apparently said, well, that's just fine, because all we need you to do is to put your hand up when we tell you, so that we get this legislation through. So in other words, these stories I'm trying to tell are about how the whole system is set up not to achieve the best possible outcome in terms of legislation, but in terms of keeping the dominant government in power. And I think it just tells a story about how dysfunctional our politics is, and how people do get used to it, and therefore it gets harder really to try to change it. Sorry, that was a very long answer.
Yeah. No, it's wonderful. And it sort of brings me on to this question of this subject that you've been doggedly and faithfully working away at for decades, around the climate crisis and the nature crisis. And this, anyone who's got anywhere close to it, this just the sheer sense of how is it possible that we have not done the things that we have known for a long time that we need to do. And there's the kind of, there's the systems and power analysis around wicked problems. And there's, what you've spoken about in terms of a failure of imagination and empathy. And I guess I wanted to put to you a kind of thesis I'm working away on that I haven't landed, but my background is kind of, I want to be bringing theological ideas into the mainstream and say there's wisdom here. And I'm trying, which is an ambitious thing to be doing, to offer this concept of sin as not a kind of legal concept that is about punishment and reward, but a relational concept which is about disconnection from ourselves and the earth and each other. And yes, the divine, but I think it's useful even if you can't get on board with that. And so I'm writing about avarice and greed and this sense of an insatiable desire for comfort and convenience and frankly consumer crap that I feel very complicit in and hypocritical in, and which my scriptures are very, very starkly, clearly warning against the dangers of. The love of money, the deceitfulness of wealth, the lie that accumulation will save us.
Yeah.
And part of me wants to ask, I've heard you occasionally say that some of this government's decisions are wicked. And not as a way of pointing fingers at others, frankly, but as a frame to help us realize the seriousness of our own complicity in this. Do we need more robust moral language again? Is this in fact actually a spiritual problem, not just a scientific and technocratic one? That's sort of what I wanted to chew over with you.
No, I think you've put it very, very eloquently, very beautifully. And yes, I think in its broadest sense, it is a spiritual problem. I mean, it is about meaning, isn't it? And I think increasingly in our post-consumerist society, people are encouraged to find meaning through consumption, and maybe, frankly, the traditional ways of being able to find meaning feel less accessible to people for a whole range of reasons. And therefore, if meaning is about what you consume rather than who you are, then it's not surprising that is driving us into an ever deeper ecological crisis, because we know there just isn't enough resource for all of us to continue to try to find meaning in that way. I think there is some hope in the fact that I think an increasing number of people are recognizing that, and there does feel, actually among young people in particular, a bit of a pushback against, having the latest phone or the latest gadget or whatever. And it's small beginnings, but I think perhaps we've got to a point now in that kind of spiritual crisis that we face where people are finding meaning in other less consumerist ways. And there, I think there is some hope.
Yes, I think the lie that if you get rich or hot or have a load of social media followers, you will be happy. Most of us just we always knew that wasn't the case, but all the imaginative machinery funnels you in that direction. And I think, I hope there is more of an appetite for just calling bullshit on that. I also think the kind of like the way, please.
No, I'm sorry. I was going to just.
I'd love to hear what you're going to say.
Words about. There's a little bit of a delay. Sorry, on the call. I was just going to talk about the role of advertising. And some friends of mine have just produced a book called Badvertising, which tries to deconstruct somewhat the whole advertising industry and to give us the tools to recognize how and when we're being manipulated. And it does feel as if we have this extraordinary industry which is set up on the premise of trying to persuade us to spend money we don't have on things we don't need, to make impressions that don't last on people we don't even care about. And that was a lovely formulation by I've just forgotten his name now, Tim Jackson, a formulation from Professor Tim Jackson at the University of Surrey. But more and more, I think people are beginning to try to unpack that whole industry, which is set up to make us feel bad, essentially, because it's only by buying the latest gizmo or gadget that we are going to be able to feel good about ourselves. And of course, that's just a never-ending spiral of doom once we accept that premise.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, there's so much I want to say about that with you, but I want to honor your time on this very busy day on the beginning of a election campaign. But you have spoken about standing down at this election, and I think just to really quite inspiring, written very honestly and beautifully about your reasons. And my ears pricked up when I heard that you were interested in training as a death doula. So I hope you will forgive me. This is very self-indulgent, but I want to read a very tiny bit of the book I have coming out today, because I think it connects these two things. And I would love to just hear you respond to it. And it's in a chapter that I wrote about baptism. And then I say, in his book on what might be beyond climate collapse, environmental writer Dougald Hine underlined the importance of ritualized encounters with our own death. He argues that industrial society is only possible because of the millennia of dead things that fossil fuels represent have tried to hide death from us. We think talk of it morbid and tidy the dying away, outsourcing their care mainly to the underpaid and undervalued. And this death phobia hampers our ability to become grown up. Hine's point is that the loss of these rituals, the community participation in bringing children across the threshold of adulthood via these initiations like baptism, is just one of the many things we have lost in a culture of disconnection. Because when we deny death, we deny limits, think we are above cause and effect. To be a grown-up, he argues, is to live alert to consequences, to know the cost of your living. It is hard to be a grown-up in the world we have made.
Wow.
He's amazing. You should get hold of his book.
I'm going to definitely get hold of that.
But I'd love to just... Yeah.
Brilliant.
So do you feel it? The connection between your draw to think deeply and be present in death?
Yes, I mean, I'm still just kind of reeling from that really beautiful way of expressing it. And I think there's so much truth in what you just said, and we could, spend days unpacking all of that. But there's certainly something I think about the way in which we've basically hidden away death, and it's the last taboo, and we never talk about it, and what that means for the way that we live in all sorts of ways. Partly it reminds me of your very first question about what being fully alive means, and being fully alive means also being fully alive to the fact of death and living life with death very much in mind. And I'm really interested. I haven't much thought until you just read it like that about the link to how our marginalizing of the idea of death means that we do live in a way that makes us think we can go on forever, and therefore, that feeds directly into this kind of consumerist culture where we never really think very much about what happens to all the shit that we throw away. But in terms of my own motivation, I guess I am concerned just on a more personal level about how in the West in general, and maybe even in the UK in particular, we do seem to be very bad at dealing with end of life, in the sense that so many people we know would much prefer to die at home surrounded by their loved ones, and yet we have this enormous stress on making people better at all costs, no matter what kind of quality of life that looks like and what their own wishes are. And so death becomes so medicalized, over-medicalized. I mean, that's not to say there aren't occasions when you'd be very, very grateful for medical intervention towards the end of life, and quite rightly so. But I think a more honest debate about how we approach the end of life and what we would want at the end of life would make things so much better for the living and the dying, and the role of ritual in that. I would love to explore with you. One of my favorite books is Francis Weller's the Wild Edge of Sorrow, in which he makes such a powerful case for the importance of ritual, and I absolutely believe in that. And I think the way that you've just described it, in terms of that kind of threshold between childhood and adulthood, whatever, however you mark that, whether that's through baptism or anything else, I think would be a way of connecting. I mean, I loved what you said about a culture of disconnection. It would be a way of connecting the way we live and the whole premise of limits. And as you say, we bulk against any idea of limits on anything. And one of the biggest challenges I've had in Parliament is getting people to recognize that there have to be some kind of limits to growth. I set up an all-party group with the title Limits to Growth, because we know that if by growth we mean more of the same extractive economic system that's led us to all of the environmental problems we have right now, if we think we can do that on a planet of finite resources, we are so misguided. but it's so difficult. I think that's probably the hardest thing I've tried to do in Parliament, is to get that on the record, because people will mock it, they will avoid it, they will tell us technologies mean that we don't even have to confront it. And I think you're very right to make a parallel between how that manifests itself in a debate about material resources also has connections in how we live our own lives, thinking that there's no limit to our own life, so we can just go on without really thinking about what that end of life is going to be like.
Yeah. And again, I just think these questions are they're so spiritual, right? There's so much about these moral profundity of our deep values, and we're so nervous of those things that we try and make them technocratic, and that's, it's tripped us up. I can't let you go without getting you to say a little bit about this, Another England, which is this beautiful meditation on the stories and the literature of England as a nation. And I'd love you just to say kind of what led you to write this book, and what is the key thing you want people to take from it?
Thank you for the opportunity to do that. So the reason, a lot of people have said, why are you only writing about England? Why not the UK as a whole? And the reason for that is because I worry about what might happen if Scotland becomes independent, which I think is entirely likely within a generation. The island of Ireland could easily reunite. The Sinn Féin First Minister has said she would be anticipating a referendum on that before 2030. Even in Wales, there's a new movement towards greater independence. And all of those are fine. My only concern is where does that leave England? Where do we ever think about what kind of England do we want? And it feels to me that those on the left, broadly speaking, are pretty squeamish about talking about England, because it feels as if the right of the political spectrum have had pretty much a monopoly on defining Englishness. One thinks of the kind of world-beating Boris Johnson type rhetoric. You think of English exceptionalism, of imperial nostalgia, and I think there's a real squeamishness on the left about even talking about England. But if we let that be the case, then I think that's very dangerous, because we know that there is a rising tide of populism that is sweeping not just Europe and America, but certainly here in the UK too, and therefore telling more compelling stories about a more progressive England, one that we can feel proud of and that can inspire us to go on trying to make England as best as it possibly can be. That feels even more urgent right now. So in the book, what I've tried to do is to use the lens of literature to remind us of some of the more progressive traditions within England. So, for example, looking at the poetry of John Clare, one of my favourite poets, and how he spoke out so eloquently and strongly against the enclosure of land being taken away from the commoners in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries. But he talks so beautifully about that, and just reminds us that human beings are not separate from nature. I think one of the real takeaways from his poetry, and just you can see it in the syntax of the poems, is that the human being is absolutely part of the natural world. It's not that, as there is in some poetry, where you've got the observer, the poet is the observer, and quite often he is observing the natural world as something other and different and over there. In John Clare, the observer and the natural world are totally immersed and entangled. And that feels to me that it's speaking to something really important right now, where, for example, there's a wonderful organization called Lawyers for Nature who are trying right now to change the Oxford English Dictionary definition of nature, which currently does define nature as other, to mean instead that we have a definition that puts human beings and nature as part of the same thing. So those mindsets that we bring to the natural world will influence what kind of country that we're building going forward and creating going forward. So taking inspiration from literature, whether it's John Clare when it comes to our relationship with the natural world, or whether it's Elizabeth Gaskell when it comes to the importance of of workers having their own rights and standing up for themselves through trade unionism. Just looking at those traditions and thinking that we can tell much more compelling stories of a much more progressive England that we already see if we look backwards, and which we can continue to create if we do it deliberately and mindfully, rather than just listening to the stories that too often get told of England, which tends to be the more regressive stories, I think.
Yes. And it comes back to this imagination, right? That we the stories that we tell and the imagination that we allow to be formed in us changes the choices that we make and the way we show up in the world. Caroline Lucas, I am so grateful for your time today on one of the busiest days of the year for you. I hope we get to talk again at some point, but I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for talking to me on The Sacred.
Well, it's been a real pleasure and privilege. Thank you so much.
Well, as you will have heard, that was slightly briefer than usual because we were recording it the day after Rishi Sunak called the general election in the UK. And honestly, the fact that Caroline didn't cancel as she would have been expected to do as someone who is, yes, standing down as an MP, but still very involved in her party and going into campaign mode for the next election, I think really speaks to what she talked about, integrity. And I felt really grateful for the time she was able to give. She said this thing about it's possible to go several days without remembering that you're alive. And really struck me. It's one of those things that's sort of ridiculously simple and so easily becomes a cliche or a truism, and yet is so deeply true that all of our wisdom traditions teach something about the importance of presence, about being in today, noticing this moment, not living too much in the past or in the future. Mine talks about, do not worry about tomorrow. Very hard thing to do. Give us today our daily bread. Notice what you have received and give thanks for it. And our attention is so often scanning for the negative and scanning for the future that it's actually really hard to just notice our chair, right? Notice what's outside our window, notice the feeling of our own skin or the sounds that we can hear. And that feels really central for a lot of people's vision of what fully aliveness is. I was left with a sense from Caroline about how skilled she is at communication. I don't think it's an accident that she started in literature and storytelling was quite an atypical background for an MP. She's just likable, She manages to be really direct about climate change and the urgency of the problem without, from what I've heard and listened to from her, really falling into hectoring or shaming or judging. It's a very difficult needle to thread. There is a tendency, I think, with campaigners, and I want to make clear, I think we really need campaigners, those prophetic voices who push for justice, who see injustice in the world and want to act, who want to lay down, who want to stand up. I want to honor those people and their courage. But because they're often driven by urgency and fear and anger, they can really easily be tipping other people into a similar state of fight or flight, into a similar state of defensiveness. Actually, it's quite difficult to persuade people out of anger and fear. And what I was hearing from Caroline is she has a very ear attuned to how things sound with the people that she's trying to talk to. She actually really listens. She has an empathy towards people's normal lives. And it's, maybe why she's been such a long-standing Green MP. And we talked about avarice and this lie that greed tells us, that there will be no consequences for our acquisitiveness, that we can just consume more and more, that we can let our baseline of normal for comfort and convenience just drift ever upwards. That this belief that stuff will save us is true. And I don't think anyone intellectually assents to it, but we are all in this enormously powerful imaginative machine which says keep climbing, keep accumulating, keep performing, keep earning. And that chapter in my book, the chapter on avarice, was the most uncomfortable one to write because of how complicit and hypocritical I feel, how much I feel formed by these cultural stories and the economic system in which I live and move and have my being. And this conversation with Caroline left me with this sense of, okay, what is the role of imagination here? If what's happening now is the failure of imagination, is the failure to imagine a potentially catastrophic future, and the failure to imagine the already present suffering of others, the consequences for others of my choices, how do I build that imagination muscle? And I think what I need now is stories of people living lives of simplicity and generosity and doing it joyfully. You know, it not being all hair shirt and deprivation. But if it's true that stuff can't save us, then it shouldn't be entirely possible to live simple, generous, interconnected, relational, joyful lives. Probably not going to get those stories from Instagram. I'm not going to get them from advertising. I'm going to have to go looking elsewhere for them. Maybe you can send me some. And finally, death. I love talking about death. I'm such a weirdo. It's possible I might go full Thomas More and have a memento mori skull on my desk. I think remembering one day I will be a skeleton is remarkably clarifying. And Caroline's, pivot from MP to death doula reminds us that these meaningful moments of birth and death cut through the nonsense, cut through the noise, and remind us what are the kind of lives we want to be living, who are the kind of people we want to be becoming, which is such a key theme of what I'm trying to write about. And if it sparked your interest about death, I'd love to point you to Theos's research on death that's come out in the last, within this year, particularly the annual lecture by Catherine Mannix and a beautiful animation that Theos did in collaboration with her, really looking at changing attitudes to death and helping equip people to think and talk about death more easily, ways into it, because it can be quite a triggering subject for a lot of people. I'm sure we'll hear more from Caroline as she journeys into that different career. I hope we do. I'm really glad that you listened, and I look forward to speaking to you next time. The Sacred is a production of the think tank Theos, and we'd love you to go check out our wider work. We have a sister podcast called Reading Our Times. Our production team is Fiona Hanscom, Dan Turner, and Amari Yagandran, and we are edited by Drew Hawley. Our music is by Luke Stanley. I'm Elizabeth Oldfield, and that's all from me for now.